We'll take the foreplay as read.
I'm glad no one saw that. People might talk.
What the fuck is he on about? Fuck are you on about? Inconceivable!
It's a free country, don't you know that?
I didn't know it was that free.
Don't make people into heroes.
Fuck you. I can live my own life in my own way if I want to.
Welcome to A Shilling for Your Thoughts. I'm your host, Heidi Shilling, and I have two very special guests with me today. We have
Duane.
We have my grandfather, Duane, and we have my grandmother,
Carolyn.
And when did you guys grow up? Do you want to say what year you were born or what era you grew up in?
Some people told me I never have. But
well, what year were you born?
I was born in 1932. I'm older than dirt.
You're older than dirt. What about you, Grandma?
I was born in 1937.
All right, so you were both born in the 30s, and now here we are in 2018. So I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about what you've learned in your lifetimes, in your great lifetimes, and what you've learned about things like politics, what your take on the world is. You want to start, Grandpa?
Well, I remember in physics class, there was a law that I learned that said nothing is constant but constant change. And that has been the way it has been ever since in my entire life. Everything changes and changes and changes. Well, for example, when I was a child, there was no television sets. Few radios, wagons, but the telephone was a thing that you rung on the little ringer on the side of it, and you ring 3 rings or 2 rings, and everybody on the line could get on and listen to your private conversations. So there have been so many changes, and sometimes it's hard to adjust to them. A
little bit makes you feel a little bit like a time traveler.
Yeah. Milton Friedman has a good book out. It's called Thank You for Being Late, that addresses this very problem that we face as change, how it has accelerated, especially with the advent of the computer.
So when you guys grew up, you can both answer this. What was your household like? What kinds of technologies did you or did you not have?
Well, the first part of my life, I grew up on a farm in Nebraska, and then later we moved to Kansas. But the first 7 or 8 years of my life was typical farm life, out in the country, no electricity, because electricity didn't come to the middle of the United States until well after World War II. So most of the farms had no electricity.
What about running water?
Did not have running water. That was yes, we had a pump that you pumped your own water, and then you heated it, and then you took the tub into your bedroom, and you took a bath. And,
I think I wouldn't take very many baths.
Well, the truth is that most people didn't.
Yeah, you had to do all that work.
Until it got springtime, and then you go out into the creek.
Just take a bath in the creek.
And then to go to the bathroom, you went out to
the yes, the bath. The house was 4 rooms and a path, we said. The path was out to the outhouse.
Except at wintertime.
As a matter of fact, I have a catalog in my possession of outhouses that you could order.
Oh my gosh!
Some were much
you
more,
ordered them?
Oh, of course. Some were fancy, and some were not so fancy. There was 2-story ones.
Oh my gosh! I always just kind of thought people just built a shack on a hole. I didn't know you could order them, have them all.
Mostly they did.
This was a comic book.
This was the fancy ones, huh?
This is a picture of actual outhouses that people had. So.
That's funny. What about you, Grandma? What kinds of stuff was in your house?
Well, I grew up in a house that was over 100 years old. It was built by the time I left, it was built before 1900, but it was a farmhouse, and it had a pump outside, but it no longer was being used because we did have a modernized watering system. We had water in the house. We had even modern, so to speak, bathroom toilets and a bathtub, and we did have upstairs, downstairs. The one bathroom I think was just a room that they made it into a bathroom, and it was
like an added on.
Yeah, well, it was part of the house, yeah. And some of the house we had a back staircase that went up to the back and front one to the front, but it wasn't a real big house at all. We had. My fondest memories would be of the radio and the radio shows that we got to listen to growing up. And probably some of my favorites were The Shadow Knows. And
He do?
and we would start the morning with hot roasting, and you surely would agree that the morning breakfast gives you cowboy energy. Now, that was for one of the cowboy shows that we used to listen to.
Do you like the cowboy shows?
It was Tom Mix. Well, we had no choice.
It was just whatever was on.
That's true. And at nighttime, some of my fondest memories were snuggling in bed with Mom and Dad and my two brothers and me. We'd all taken our showers. We were all showers, bathtubs. We'd all taken our baths and had dinner, and we were going to listen to the Most Wanted Convict show.
Oh my gosh!
Or there was another one that was I can't remember it, but it was a show about the criminals out there, and
it's like a true crime one.
Yeah, and it had these people are still wanted, and what was the name of the one that they said we're still looking for this convict, so call the FBI if you see him.
Like the most wanted list. So for all you people out there that listen to My Favorite Murder, Grandma was an OG of Murderino.
So anyway, and my mode of operation was a bicycle, and we did have cars. Grandpa, however, had a horse with a wagon, and his parents went to town to buy groceries on a horse and wagon, and he said he crossed the Missouri.
No, the Missouri.
Missouri
in the
River
wintertime.
when it was ice.
Oh my
gosh. It's frozen solid. You could cross it.
So he was a generation before me, but I still did not have we didn't get television until I was in senior high school.
Oh wow, okay. What about you, Grandpa? Did you guys ever have a TV?
No.
Never?
No. But I might add, my wife was the third child in her family, the third of twins. There were 3. I was the last of 12 children in my family, so
yeah,
it was a little different, Sarah.
A little bit, yeah. And you grew up in a little bit different areas and stuff.
Yes.
What kind of schools did you guys both go to? Like a one-room schoolhouse? I know you did, Grandpa.
I did for the first 3 years, for grades 1, 2, and 3. I went to Lime Grove School in Nebraska.
And I can remember the saddest story I ever heard was that as a first grader, he went at Christmas time, and the teachers Santa came, and Santa handed out presents, he told me, to everybody in the whole school. How big was the school?
Oh, it was grades 1 through 8, so there's probably 2 or 3 kids in each grade.
So 12, 14 students,
yeah.
15. But lo and behold, Santa didn't have a present for him.
Santa didn't have a present for you? Why not?
In first grade. Until later on they went, the teachers went in the back room and found him something, probably coloring books or crayons and so forth.
Actually, they found me a truck, a tanker type truck.
Okay.
So
Oh.
they must have had some extra toys,
One of my fondest memories of grade school was one year we got some really rip-snorting snows before Christmas, and it must have been mid-December we got this storm that came in, and they knew it was going to be a bad one. So they closed school at noon and sent us all home. We walked, and there were some that got bused, so they got bused home. But from the time we came home that day, we were supposed to have a Christmas pageant, and we were practicing for that, and all ready and excited. We never gave that Christmas pageant. We never finished the last week before Christmas for school, and we never saw a car on the 8th Street, which was a 2-lane highway, but it wasn't a very big highway. And we never saw those for 3 weeks, I think.
Oh my gosh.
The snowmobiles, the snow shovelers could come out. So we walked, we got on the sled. My dad took us probably a mile and a half to a grocery store, piled up and bought groceries from a town place.
Oh my gosh.
And then we walked back with our groceries. And for 3 weeks, that was sort of exciting. We had great tunnels with snow in the tunnels and everything. So.
Wow.
And you?
What?
What other wonderful happened to you?
Oh, I don't know. It's been so long ago.
What were the politics like when you guys were young? Do you remember very much about them?
Well, you see, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president, and he was the president for 4 terms. So he's the only president I knew for a long time.
For a long time.
The thing that I think about most from that time is, in the 1930s and so on, For the farmers, there was no such thing as price supports. So I remember my father sold our last load of fat hogs for 50 cents a head.
Wow.
We couldn't afford to be a farmer, and there was no such thing as Social Security. If you got old and you had no money, you went to something called a county poor farm, and you got, some meals and a place to stay. The people today have no idea how much we have progressed as a society in taking care of the members of our society. And there are a lot of people who call it socialism. I call it being socially active and taking care of your citizens. But things have changed so much that when I hear people complain today, I think, well, they should go back and live then, and then maybe they would realize how much good stuff they have. There was no such thing as unemployment insurance. There was no such thing as time off. Kids worked. They had to work to support the family, so their education went out the window. So we have, as a society, we have made a great deal of progress, and I just hope we don't toss it out the window.
Me too. Do you think you guys, when you were younger, did you notice the politics, or did you think that wasn't really something that you noticed until when did you start noticing politics?
Well, I wouldn't have put it under the heading of politics. I know that during the Depression, there were many farmers where I lived who had come from the Scandinavian countries, and they lost their farm to the banks, and some of them just went out to the barn and hanged themselves. But I didn't think of it as being politics at that time. But the whole business of not taking care of the society, and this was a great thing that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did with his New Deal. Herbert Hoover had been the president before, and he was a businessman president. And people were starving to death. They had no work. Well, Franklin Roosevelt came in, and many conservatives today would call him a socialist, but he started programs like the WPA, Works Program Administration, put people to work building highways and doing all sorts of things so they got some money. Otherwise, they would have starved to death. And many of the programs, and he was also responsible for starting Social Security and many other things. So,
do you think you noticed those at the time? Or was that something looking back on now you notice more?
Well, I know that because of hearing adults talk when I was a kid. But it wasn't. We didn't associate it with politics so much as the economy and who was in power and who was.
You think you still paid a little bit of attention to that? You listened when the adults talked and you absorbed a little bit of it.
Sure. And then Franklin Roosevelt was the first one to start communicating with society at large with his fireside chats on the radio. And if you didn't have a radio, you went over to the neighbors and you sat around and listened to them.
Tuned in.
Yeah.
I can remember that the fireside chats with Franklin Delano Roosevelt were very important, and almost all the adult men would go into the living room and listen on the radio while the women cleaned up the dishes, because they were so concerned about the World War II and what was happening and how Hitler had obliterated practically everybody in Europe, so to speak. But I do remember the one thing too, that how many sacrifices our parents and grandparents did for the good of the country and for the help during the war. We saved aluminum foil.
There was a lot of programs for bonds, and
my grandmother never got silk stockings after she saved the last 2 or 3 pair and canned them, because they were supposed to stay longer that way. And my little buggy scraped her leg one day and ripped a hole in her stocking, which made me feel very bad. But my mother had 3 children in 2 years, and she had to work hard. They had coupons and rations on sugar, butter, meat, shoes, you name it. And you didn't get a new pair of shoes because you wanted them. You got a new pair of shoes when the other ones were so worn out.
You couldn't fix them.
You could clip a coupon, and then you were entitled to get a pair.
So you mentioned that a lot of the women would be cleaning and stuff while the men listened. Did you ever try to pay attention to politics too, or did you think that that's just kind of how things were? Were you also off, not paying as much of attention as the men, do you think, at that age? Because you would have been about what age?
Well, I think probably when I was a junior, senior high,
high school.
I would notice that who was going to win the presidency or who didn't. And Wendell, what was his name? Wilkie lost to Truman?
No, he lost to Roosevelt.
Did he lose to Truman? I thought too, maybe.
No,
anyway,
no.
Well, whatever. And if you were a Republican, you were not happy about that. And my parents were Republican, and so when the Republicans didn't win, it wasn't as good. And they were very unhappy, so to speak. However, there were never any riots, and there never were any other problems such as that.
Well, what about growing up when there was like movements going on? Do you remember any movements or any political issues?
Oh yeah, as I got older, but most of those kinds of things happened.
Like civil rights. Do you really remember?
No, those came much later. The civil rights were in the 60s.
Yeah, you weren't as young then, but that's something that happened within your lifetime.
Oh yeah, and of course I remember the revolt against the Vietnam War. And young people were taking off for Canada in droves, and they were maligned. And I remember my older brother, who was, a lot older than I was, and had retired from the Army. I said something about the Vietnam War being a waste and a terrible thing, and he really lit into me like I was being unpatriotic.
Very interesting that at that time patriotism was if you didn't want a war, if you didn't want this, right, you were considered unpatriotic just for having a different opinion.
Right, and of course the kids that fled to Canada, they weren't going to be drafted to serve in Vietnam. They were branded as cowards, which is certainly not true. They weren't cowards. They were following the dictates of their conscience. And it turns out they were right. And people like McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense, and some of the generals. And, well, we all know what took place in Vietnam now, how that war went.
So growing up, though, during the war, Grandma, did you have any opinions on it? Like Grandpa did, he kind of thought, well, what a waste. Did you have that same opinion? Or were you so surrounded by people that were all for it?
Well, I'm not sure. The World War II would have been already initiated by the time I was just in grade school. So I do remember that my dad really liked Nixon, and he was so impressed with him. Well, by the time Nixon finished his political career, he was in disgrace and he had been impeached. So I noticed that, and I got to thinking too that this man is not a real reliable soul. I also remember I dated a fellow, and he became an officer that was sent to Vietnam in the very early years to sort of set up the idea that the Americans were going to take over and control their country.
Interesting.
And years later we found out, and assassinate their leader.
Yes.
And so forth. And now that we see reviews of history, we realize how much interference we made in history and in the Korea and Vietnam and everything.
So you think maybe you noticed that more looking back than at the time it didn't hit you as much, so that was something later on you kind of saw.
Yeah. Oh yes, now we realize that we forced our democracy on countries that couldn't handle it.
Well, what about civil rights? What do you guys remember about that time? Do you remember much about that?
Yeah, I do.
Tell them about the pools.
I could never quite understand. In the town that I grew up in Junction City, Kansas, we had right next door to Fort Riley, Kansas, and there were many, many black soldiers, and they had just come back from World War II, and yet they could not eat in the restaurants in this small town. And
how horrible.
It was even more ironic because the one restaurant, a good restaurant, is called The Circle, was run by a Chinese fellow who could hardly speak English. But the only way he would serve black people was in the kitchen.
Interesting.
They could not stay in hotels or motels, which was also a terrible thing because when they had orders cut to cross the country, like if they were in Georgia and they had to go through San Francisco, they had to travel across the United States. Well, where were they going to stay?
And the military didn't really take care of that. They just assumed they would find something.
And they took care of it by having friends or somebody they knew that they could stay.
They had to find somebody to stay with.
And it struck me at the time that this was god-awful unfair of our society. And this was really brought home to me at one of my high school reunions when one of the black students in my high school class, Gilbert Hammond, told me that when he was growing up, he couldn't swim in our municipal swimming pool, except on the days, the day before that they were going to drain the pool and refill it.
Yeah.
And he said, here I am paying taxes on this thing, and I can't even stick my big toe in it. So slowly, my awareness of the terrible mistreatment of the black people in our society came about. But I was pretty much aware of this, I think, when I was in high school.
Yeah, you think as a child, or not child really, but as a young adult, you were able to look around and realize that it wasn't right.
Oh.
Did you feel like you had the ability to do something about it, or did you feel kind of helpless, like you couldn't really do much?
Well, when you're young, maybe young kids are different now, but when you're young, you're thinking about your job, how you're going to get a job, and then when you get married and you have children, you're worried, you're so involved in that a lot of the politics goes right over your head. You don't pay attention, and I think this happens today. People are so involved and preoccupied and occupied in making money and providing for their family that they seldom read in depth any political treatise or anything like that. So,
do you think sometimes it's that situation where, unfortunately, if it doesn't affect you, you don't necessarily notice it? If you're able to swim, maybe it's not on the top of your mind and it's not anything malicious. It's just that you're not being bombarded with that daily, so you're not thinking about it. Whereas it's like, if that's something that's a situation that's happening to somebody, it's probably something that they're thinking about more and trying to change more just because it affects them.
That's true. And everybody is a product of his time, and you live in your own time. Mm-hmm. For example, if you read To Kill a Mockingbird, the all-white jury would not do anything to Mayella Ewell because she was mm-hmm. white, and Mr. Robinson, was black. So even though they knew what had transpired, mm-hmm. they were going to vote a certain way. And that's the way you are. You grow up in an environment, you grow up in a milieu, and you pretty much live within that. It's only when you can get out of that, and this is why it's so important for young people to go and have an education away from home and be confronted with ideas that are so much different from what they've been accustomed to. And this is mm-hmm. a definition of what a true education is about. I would also like to see many, many more people travel abroad and experience other countries and see how they think about us and see what their culture is like. We don't always have the very best of everything, even though many times we think we are.
And that's not unpatriotic to say that. In fact, I think it's more patriotic that you can acknowledge that we could do better.
It's a matter of facing reality.
What about you, Grandma? Do you remember the civil rights movement very well?
Well, even before that, I grew up in a sort of an agricultural area mm-hmm. in the township, but we were surrounded by big city, and there were all sorts of ethnic groups, and we had the Polish, the Irish, the German, and they all had their sections, and the blacks, and so we were a conglomeration of many races, and there wasn't as much civil unrest there.
Okay, you think it was more because if somebody, when you're in the city like that and there's so many people, you're passing them every day, you're seeing them, you're interacting with them. So do you think that maybe led to less prejudices? Because even though people had their own separate areas, people tend to gather with people that are like themselves, especially if they come from another country. They want to be with people that speak their native language, things like that. But they're still having to interact because it's a big city. They can't stay as separated. Do you think that kind of helped with that? Where it was like, when you're forced to interact with somebody, it's kind of hard to be prejudiced to somebody?
Right. Well, for example, growing up, we only had maybe one black child all the way through school that was in our school system. But in the city, they had many mm-hmm. groups and many blacks. And the blacks always performed well in sports. So they were always active in football and basketball and baseball. And so there was a lot of interaction. I don't think there was a lot of discrimination. However, my twin brother grew up thinking the blacks were an inferior group, just
Oh,
like
wow.
my husband's brother
Yeah.
felt that they were inferior, and we're shaking our heads and thinking, why? I went to college, and there was lots of integration there, including foreign exchange students and everything. So I think I wised up. The difference today is there is such a tremendous immediate media coverage of everything, including politics, including anything that happens.
It happens quicker.
Historically. So
you have to adapt quicker and learn quicker.
The kids today probably are much more aware of all these political issues and social issues than we were.
Yeah, you think maybe you interacted with somebody that was being mistreated and you might not have even known it because they might not have known what you thought politically, so they're not going to bring it up to you maybe.
Well, we were the innocent 50s when we were in high school and college. And truly, these were years that didn't have anything but Sputnik to worry about. There wasn't as much bullying. There wasn't as much of anything, I don't think.
No. And let me get on my soapbox here a minute. To me, the greatest democratizing institution ever invented was the American public school system because it brought various cultures together. Like my wife just mentioned, in her community there was a German community and the Italian community and a Polish community. Well, they would all go to the same high school and they would learn from each other. Now, in 1954, the Supreme Court, in a case called Brown versus Board of Education, declared that it was unconstitutional to separate schools because they had schools for black kids and schools for others. And the worst part of that was that this creates animosity and hatred and distrust when you separate people. Now we have the same thing going on in reverse today in a different angle. All of these charter schools and private schools, the motivation for people wanting their kids in these schools are exactly the same ones that the South had.
A sense of superiority.
Right. They didn't want their children, if they're white, they didn't want their children going to school with those other ethnic groups. But in the long run, this is a terrible thing, and what it does, it sort of balkanizes our society, and we're already divided so much, and this is just going to divide it more. Instead of separating like they're trying to do, we should be coming together.
Well, both of you have traveled a lot. You've even lived in other countries.
Yes.
What do you think you learned? Can you tell us about some experiences you guys had in different countries that you either traveled or stayed in for long periods of time?
Well, one thing we learned in Australia, the Australians loved and admired and worshipped Americans and their entertainment, their theater,
their movies,
and they loved to imitate and this sort of thing. That was back in the 80s. So, and they seemed to make the same mistakes, though, that we did when it came to how we treated our Native Americans.
That's correct.
In America. Then, by the same means, they were doing the same things. They were separating them and trying
Aboriginals.
The Aboriginals and excluding them. And yet, if they had looked to see what we were doing, they wouldn't have made that same mistake.
So did you think that they maybe weren't as critical of the U.S. at that time because of the fact that they were kind of in a similar political situation? Or do you think they still had a couple criticisms that you would hear, like about health care or politics or anything like that?
Oh, they had criticisms. I do remember when the Challenger spaceship blew up, they sort of, and it sort of hurt me. Some said, well, that's the smart aleck Americans. They think they can do everything.
Yeah. Interesting.
The only time that changed the conversation was then right after that we had the nuclear mishap in Russia.
Yeah, you're talking about Chernobyl?
Yeah. And that took the attention away from the Challenger more so. But they also treated us like the know-it-all Americans.
So you did have a little bit of that surrounded you, was that stereotypically you guys were know-it-alls. Interesting.
Well, not us.
But the Americans, that's what kind of followed you, that you had to...
They embraced us, and they took us in just like people from their neighborhood. I mean,
there was a period of the ugly American abroad. And they did. They had a lot of money and everything. But the thing I noticed when we go to England with visit our English friends, their cars are smaller. They're much more economical. Their appliances are smaller, and they don't have 15 million choices of everything. And when they came over here, they said, your problem is you're spoiled by choice. We have too many choices, and we want everything bigger and better. We got cars that are the size of their houses, and obviously, when there's a large percentage of the world that doesn't even get enough food, this rubs them the wrong way, and we need to be cognizant of that. And since we are such a rich country, we need to help these countries, and we have in the past. But I'm fearful of what's going to happen in the future.
What do you guys feel about what's happening with politics now, with regards to just politics in general, social movements, the children recently speaking out? Do you have any thoughts on that, Grandma? You're making a face.
You betcha. The kids today in Florida were geniuses, and they have started the gun control push, and it's finally awakened some people. Dick's Sporting Goods is one of the smartest moves. His CEO should be made president.
I know. Whatever. I'm thinking, what should I go buy from them just to buy something?
Me too. And some of the other companies and airlines and everything have realized what a tremendous influence the NRA has had on our elections and on the people that become elected president and so forth. So I would say, and the Me Too and the disaster in Florida have awakened the U.S. now.
So what would you say about the youths that are speaking up? If those were your grandchildren, would you be proud of them?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And what would you say to people that talk bad about them and say they're just stupid kids that don't know anything, or call them spoiled, or...
I'd tell them what they really are. They're a bunch of dumbasses.
Yeah, would you?
But I haven't met a person that hasn't just been in awe of them and respected them. I have a 77-year-old woman friend who will be marching with the Me Too and everything. But
wonderful.
And we all respect them so much for what they have done. And everything they want and have said, let's change in the political system about guns. Yeah. It's what we want. I think 97% of the people also want background checks for any kinds of weapons.
Well, and the funny thing is, I am a gun owner, and I was able to get it so scary easy. I own a gun. I still want these restrictions. I want it to be difficult. I want it to be harder for me to buy a gun than it is to buy a car. Yeah. I want it to be licensed the same way. And a lot of people say, I'm scared that my gun's going to take. I'm not afraid of that.
I'm not either.
I know, but here's the thing. Nothing ever happens in a society or gets done unless there's a leader. You think of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, who gets my vote for the man of the 20th century. Martin Luther King. There has to be someone who takes the reign and comes forward and does this. Now, in the ranks of these young people in Florida, after listening to some of them on television, I'm sure that some of them are going to move into positions of authority, but somebody has to be the ramrod. It should be our president, but unfortunately, we're not going to get that from him. No. So someone's going to have to, and combat the NRA.
Unfortunately, you guys probably haven't heard too much of this if you're not seeing it a lot on the internet, but there are a lot of groups of people that are saying horrible things like, I wish those kids had died. I wish they had gotten shot. How dare they speak out? They don't know what they're talking about. They're children. They shouldn't be able to have feelings. They're coached. Some of them were accused. One in particular was accused of being an actor, a crisis actor, they called him. What do you have to say about things like that? Do you think that young people should have opinions heard, do have a voice, and are intelligent enough to articulate that?
Of course. This goes back to way back in the 19th century when the motto was children should be seen and not heard. I mean, this is nonsense. These kids are, I dare say that many of those seniors, juniors and seniors in that high school in Florida are much more learned and intelligent than a lot of the older people who are out there criticizing them and thinking don't know what they're talking about.
And I think we have to be so careful, and I would love to put restrictions on some of the garbage that YouTube and all of these other media
You have to be careful about that, though, because then you get into censorship.
I know.
Which I think you should be responsible, or you should be responsible for yourself or what your child views. Like, there are other countries that have far less restrictions on what's on TV. I mean, the things they have, we would blush at, and they don't have these kinds of problems because if a parent doesn't want their child to watch it, they can take the remote and change it. I think here we have parents wanting companies to be responsible for that. They don't want a parent. They want the TV to do, they want to leave their kid and not have to worry about what they see, which you can't really do.
But what about Facebook and some of the horrible things that kids have done and said? And
you hear a lot of that, but growing up with that generation, when I was a kid, we had something called a Zanga, and it was before MySpace. We had MySpace, we had Facebook. The kind of kids that usually said that to you online were the same kids that were going to say it to you at school. If it wasn't passed, in a note on Facebook, it was passed in an anonymous note where they wrote, this person is this, and would pass it around the school. It's the same kind of concept. Mm-hmm. It's just that now it can be viewed by more people. The only good thing to that is now it can be sometimes viewed by police. It can be viewed, after the fact. We've had it where before kids would get bullied to the point where they hung themselves, committed suicide. Yeah. And what proof would you have? Whereas now we can say, here's proof that these children did this. And I think that there are more challenges with everything being out there. And I warn my little sister all the time, be careful what you post, because a job search later can find your name. You have to depend on how much that matters to you. Like for me, even this podcast is attached to my name. I could have a potential employer listen to it and decide they don't like my political view. Well, you know what? That's tough. I mean,
yeah. Well, you see, you probably don't realize it when you talk to Rachel, your sister, about these things. You're performing the function of good parenting, and that is exactly what this country needs. Well, any country, there's no need for censorship if you have parenting.
That's true, and some kids are ready for stuff at an age that others aren't.
Exactly.
There are kids with smartphones. Rachel, she had a smartphone. I want to say elementary school. She had an iPhone that could access the internet, that could go on Facebook, and I had a talk with her from a young age that if you type in a website wrong, you could get to see something you don't want to see.
Yeah.
If you get somewhere and it says, are you 18 and up? Are you 21 and up? You want to back out of that. Right. And I had to have that conversation with her about, you need to make sure if somebody's talking to you and asking you questions, you go show mom and dad. You're not going to get in trouble. And that open dialogue can help. Also, just knowing at her age, she was responsible enough. She could go in her bedroom alone, have her cell phone, have the internet. And my parents were worried. And I was like, she's smart. Let her be. And she made good choices. If she had concerns, she would go to mom. There was somebody that would repeatedly call her phone looking for an adult male and leave, somewhat threatening voicemails, looking for somebody that was in debt to them. And she went to my dad right away and said, this man is contacting me. He's calling me. He's texting me. I don't know who this is, and even if it was somebody where she was talking to that she thought was a kid, she would tell my parents, I was playing this game online. I think this person is an adult. And they were able to trust her. Whereas other kids in her same grade, if their parents had given them that same responsibility, they would not have been able to handle it. And those are the same kids that would leave with an individual that, they met online. And it's a lot of people think the internet's to blame. Unfortunately, they're the same individual that would meet an adult male at a mall and walk off with them.
Right.
They're the same kids that are going to make those same choices. You just have to know your child and know what you can allow them to have. And what I also find so interesting with this talk of the stupid kids don't know what they're talking about. You cannot have it both ways. Oh, an 18-year-old's an adult, they can buy a gun. Okay. Well, then an 18-year-old or a 17-year-old 1 year away can stand up to you and say, here's what I believe about gun laws. And when these people want to have it both ways, where they want to say, well, an 18-year-old is an adult, they can buy a gun. Oh, an 18-year-old's a kid, they don't know anything about politics. Sorry, sir, you got to pick. Either they're an adult and they can buy a gun and they can look you in the eye and they can tell you what they think about politics, or they're a kid and you don't sell them a gun.
Yeah. Well, the bottom line is we all know that there are very bad people in every society, and we can't shut down. We can't just lock everything down and take everybody else's rights or whatever away from them. So what we have to do is learn how to deal with these bad people on an intelligent basis and do as much as we can to curtail them.
And also, too, because we are the 21st century and everything, there's no naivete. There is no sort of easy freedoms that the 50s had and so forth. The kids today are shocked by or absorb all of this emotional events, the tragic events, and the horrible events. And some of their innocence is gone. And I feel sorry for them because I think they don't have as many joys and happy freedoms that we did.
That's probably true in a lot of ways because you just didn't have access to knowing about some of the horrible things. And people try to say, it was a different time, and it wasn't so much a different time as you guys weren't shown that.
Well, our mental health was probably better.
Probably.
And so that, too, of our parents.
Well, in some ways.
In some ways. I do remember, Grandpa, you talking about hearing about World War II and being a little bit traumatized by that. And that was something that to you was disturbing. And even though you didn't experience the actual being there, you still were able to hear it. And it was different than nowadays being able to see it on the news and stuff. But I think it still probably affected you the same way. You were still
Japanese.
Yeah, well, I saw a lot of World War II movies when I was younger. Sands of Iwo Jima, and I knew about all the things that were going on in the South Pacific, and I knew about what was going on in Germany, and it was very frightening. And especially since I knew that I was getting along toward draft age, and I might be in those positions, and I didn't know how I would react, and it was very unsettling.
I can remember VE Day, Victory
Day,
and how it was on the radio, and everybody was just laughing and hugging, and
the relief.
They were showing all the soldiers interacting with all the people in the different countries, and how happy they were, and what a relief it was, because the war to end wars, and maybe that wasn't it, but it was over.
It was over.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to the kids of today? Would you encourage them to keep being political, keep speaking out? Would you have any advice?
Yes, I would tell them to keep doing that, and I would also tell them to read as widely as they can. They need to develop a worldview. My worldview happens to correspond to Joseph Conrad's and Henry Golding, and a few people who have written books that try to let people understand what is the nature of a human being. And a human being has a capability of doing tremendous good, like Albert Schweitzer, or they have the capability of being a terrible, terrible person like Adolf Hitler or Pol Pot or Mussolini. And they need to read widely and develop a core of beliefs which our current president does not have, and it's a known fact that he doesn't read. So read every good author you can get your hands on, and be as active and participate and pay attention. That's what I would tell them.
What about you, Grandma? Would you have anything to add?
No, I'd say everything he said, in addition to, as he mentioned, travel. The more you learn to understand and live with and appreciate other people, so the more, I think, the more you have a disposition to see both sides to the story. Yes. And before you jump into a concern or a riot or anything else, you want to understand probably all sides of it.
How would you suggest people do that? Like, do you guys like to listen to opposing viewpoints? How do you make sure you're trying to stay balanced? What do you do?
Well, for example, some people who say the Holocaust really didn't exist, why don't they go listen to some of the people who have survived the Holocaust, and they give lectures in classes, or in libraries they give lectures, and there are lots of wonderful places where they can be aware of the past history and what has gone on, and listen to their elders. I mean, once you have been there and done that and seen that, you really do have a broader
different perspective
of the world and what's happening.
And I would say it's probably the same with men listening to women, or all people listening to those that are a minority, or like Black Americans. Obviously none of us three are Black Americans. We can never know what it's like to have that experience of living the life of somebody who is a Black American. So the only thing we can do is try to listen. And some people are so quick to jump and say, you don't have it that bad, there's no racism anymore. And I think a lot of people, if they just took time to listen and not try to jump to something, I think that would be really helpful. What do you guys think?
Well, they could also read Black Like Me, which was
that's a very good one.
Which was an experiment that a young fellow did. And then you find out maybe what it's like. But she's absolutely right. I don't know what it's like to be Black. I've never been Black. That's good advice.
And you mentioned the Me Too movement, Grandma. What would you have to say to women growing up at the time you did? you talked about how politics happened and the women were cleaning while the men were involved. What would you say to women nowadays about things like the Me Too and just getting involved in politics in general?
Well, back in the days when I was young and in high school and college, we didn't have the opportunities to go out.
Exactly. The Me Too movement, do you think it couldn't have happened?
No, I don't think so. We didn't have the transportation, we didn't have the mobility, we didn't have even the understanding that we were suppressed, and if that's the right term.
Oppressed.
Oppressed, yeah. Anyway, and I think this is a natural occurrence that happened because of the events and the sexual harassment that has come into the viewpoint of everybody. And so I'm very much in favor of the Me Too and the women, and hopefully that too will make a tremendous difference in the future for politics and for all future understanding of the world.
Do you feel like a little bit some of the voices of the youth today are maybe even sort of speaking for you as well? They're speaking for their mothers, their grandmothers, maybe even their great-grandmothers who didn't really have that opportunity. That's kind of how I see it. Like when, when I'm expressing opinions, or Rachel, my little sister, I feel like we're not just expressing our own experiences, we're bringing those behind us that didn't really get a chance to have a voice. And it's interesting how sometimes you hear people wanting to, feminists, feminazis, and they immediately want to shut it down and put that on there. What about men? Men are oppressed too. Do you have anything that you would say to kind of, to those people that want to just quickly shut it down or invalidate it by saying that they've had hardships as well?
Well, I would say in viewing a past history, I would say that at least 50% of the women in the workplace probably had more than one incident where they could have sued for sexual harassment or something. For me, I had a few.
Yeah, I think it's more than 50% of women.
And I had some incidents. And back then, it was just the culture of the day, the behavior of the day, to say nothing and move on and just to let that system blow away. I never got to a situation which became horrible, but
it could have, right?
It could have, but I don't think back then we were pretty naive about everything too. We didn't have all the outlets and all the media.
There was probably a lot more of blaming yourself of something. Well, I should have done this. I shouldn't have put myself in that situation. Whereas now I think women are starting to realize that it's not your fault if you're put in a situation by somebody. You didn't put yourself there. True. It's not your problem. You're allowed to speak out. Whereas, you would have been looked at for saying certain things like, well, why did you let that happen? Why were you in that situation? Right. So it was a lot harder. Now I think people are learning that that's not right. What would you guys have to say about the patriarchy? What's your opinion on that?
Are you speaking of that person who was in the White House?
Well, he represents the patriarchy, but I mean this very patriarchal society of women should be, quiet and stay in their place, and they don't need to make as much as men. There's no wage gap. There's no Me Too. What do you say to those kind of people that don't seem to want to allow equality for everybody?
Well, I would tell them that they need to move into the 21st century. They shouldn't be trying to live back in the 19th century when we had an agrarian economy, when the wife took care of the household and the husband was out either working on the farm, or if he had a job, he was a wage earner and he didn't do a thing around the house. Now, this is one thing I started noticing quite some years back. Young husbands and wives, the husband helped in the kitchen. He helped with the dishes and he helped with this. And the wife helped with things too. Then, too, after World War II, it became more and more common for both husband and wife to have outside jobs outside the house. And that changed the whole complexion of the nuclear family, I think. So, remember what I said at the beginning. Nothing is constant but constant change. Society has changed, and people have to understand this. Women have been, put into this inferior position from the very beginning. Our religious system put them in that position. Everything Absolutely. Put them in that position, and they should be seen as equal partners. And if they're doing There are a lot of women out there who are a lot smarter than a lot of the men, and they're holding down positions in a much better fashion than a lot of men do. So wake up.
Well, I also, one of the states, and I don't even remember which one, I had heard that in the last election, Congress election, there were 100 women running for office. Now, in this election, there are 200 women running for, I think it was a congressional spot. So women are coming out, and women are being heard, and they do have brains.
The way I described it to somebody, they're like, what is this stomp the patriarchy? That sounds, rude. And I said, here's how it was. I said, years ago, women saw men up on this pedestal and said, gee, we'd like to be up there. And we reached up and they stomped us down. And we reached up and they pushed us. And we climbed and we fought. And then we got to a point where we said, you know what? This isn't working. We're not going to get up on that pedestal. We're going to smash it. We're going to bring you down. And then we're going to rebuild it. And we're going to bring everybody up. If you don't want to come down and help us, we're going to take you down. And some people have said, well, that sounds violent. It sounds cruel. And it said, but this is what happens. If you want to continuously suppress people, they're going to start using different vocabulary. They're going to start using different tactics. We're not going to just sit and go, oh, gee, or golly, it would be really nice to, come up there and make the same as a man. We're going to say, no, I'm going to take your job. We're going to look at them and go, you don't want me to make the same amount as you? I'm going to do a better job than you. You're going to get fired or laid off, and I'm going to take your job, and I'm going to wave to you. I'm going to carry your box out the door. It's that thing of, that's why I think some people get, scared or worried when it's like we're using aggressive vocalization, but they need to understand that that's also a way to not be violent, is to use aggressive, violent terms and words and be able to get it out that way and let out the frustration of years and years that, people have had built up. And it's like when guys are like, well, that sounds so bad. You want to stomp on me? And it's like, no, not unless you put us in that position. If you want to help us out, we want to be equal to you. We want everybody to be equal.
Well, they have always referred to the female as the weaker sex. And this was really practiced when I was a kid. For example, girls played basketball, but now get this. The guards could not come across the half court. They had to stay in the backcourt. Get this. The girl, whoever had the ball, could only dribble it twice. You don't want to get them too tired.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. That's were the rules of girls basketball. And the men, they didn't dare let the women show that they had prowess, because that would undermine their masculinity, see, and put them in a bad light. So things have slowly changed, and I tell you what, I think our society is so far ahead of where it was when I was a kid. With all the things that are wrong today, it's so far ahead. We've made such progress, and I just would hate to see it go back the other way. Yeah. And I'm counting on you women to keep on going.
We're going to stomp the patriarchy. We're going to get rid of that toxic masculinity.
Right. I don't want a matriarchal society either.
No, nobody does. Well, I'm sure there's a few, but...
Yeah, just to make use of talents and be happy.
And I think the youth and the Me Too will help make some needed changes. Absolutely.
They're going to make more, too.
And I think they will benefit and help in the years to come, and sort of help clean up the cesspool that's in the White House now.
We drained the swamp into the cesspool.
Well, it sounds like, you hear the Make America Great Again. Sounds like talking to you guys, that you think America is making itself great slowly over time, and it doesn't need to go back. We don't need to make it great again. We need to continue to make it greater.
Yeah, I thought that was a nonsense slogan, Make America Great Again. We've always been great. I mean, we could be greater, but make America great again? How about...
Yeah, there's nothing we want to go back to. We don't want to go back to, segregating people or treating people poorly.
Exactly.
We want to learn from the past and keep making America greater.
Exactly.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. Again, that was
Duane
and
Carolyn.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for listening.